Today, I want to teach you how to retell a book by sketching a timeline in your head of the big events, retelling only the important one. Consider the plot of a story when you're summarizing. Think of the characters, the conflict, or which we used to call the problem, the resolution or the solution, the setting. All of these things are going to help you tell the key and critical events when you summarize and giving us that previously on. When you summarize before you read on, you need to think about how the earlier parts of the story led up to the new parts. Let me show you what I mean. In this case, let's say I want to talk with my reading partner about The Year of the Dog, and he hasn't read it, so I want to tell him the gist of the story so far. The gist means just the important parts. Then he'll be able to understand and talk with me about the story. One way to summarize a story is to start at the very beginning and then take big steps across of what you've read so far, only telling the important parts. I'm going to look at my book to help me start my summary. I'll start my summary by going back to the beginning of the book. What happened in the beginning of the book? So we have a character named Pacey, or Grace, and her sisters, Lissy and Kiki, and her mom and dad, and they're celebrating Chinese New Year in their home in upstate New York. It's the Year of the Dog, which is a time for finding out who you are. This is going to be a problem for Pacey. She doesn't know who she is or what her talents are. Now I'm going to go over some of the details until I get to the next big part. So I'm going to just walk back. I can give you every little detail about every chapter. This was important. I remember this sticking out in my head. This was the time where Grandpa told the story of how he got rich as a doctor by treating people for free, and then it built his reputation. And then I remember thinking of our main character, Pacey, or Grace. She had a problem because when she heard the story, she didn't know what she was good at. She didn't discover herself yet. So they talked about that New Year a little bit more in Grandpa. And this chapter named Talent, I remember when Grace was waking up for school, and she had a hard time wanting to go to school because she didn't really know what she was good at, and Mom encouraged her and talked about the time where she slept in school. So at school, Pacey, otherwise known as Grace, and her sister Lissy are the only Chinese folks, right? Here's surprise. That tells us that there was a surprise. Do you remember where she comes across another Chinese girl and is confused for that Chinese girl by the lunch lady, and the lunch lady accuses her of taking another lunch? I think that adds to our story problem and is important to summarize and help us understand what is going on. She ends up meeting another girl named Melody in chapter 6. Melody is that Chinese girl who she's excited that someone looks like her and she wants to become good friends. Readers, do you notice how I retold the timeline of the story, moving in big steps through the sequence of events? I quickly covered the whole terrain of what I've read so far in The Year of the Dog. I only summarized the most important parts and left out the other parts. We don't need all the nitty-gritty details. I've gotten you up to speed on what's happened in our book. I've given myself one of those previously on recaps, and now I'm ready to dive back into this book and see what happens next, with what already happened fresh in my mind so that I can build on my ideas and hunches and not just start at the beginning with my thinking all over. I'd like you to try this kind of summarizing with your own book. Look back at your book for a second and think about how you can summarize the big events. Today you're going to read the books that you were reading last week or continuing on with those themes. Like, who are those characters? What's the setting? What's the character want? And what seems to be that big conflict? I'll repeat that again. When you're summarizing, think of who are the characters, what is the setting, what does the character want, and what seems to be that big conflict. Then you summarize only the important events that relate to what the character wants and what gets in their way as the story unfolds. I'm going to ask each of you today to be ready to summarize some of those key concepts when we conference. You don't need to take steps, just summarize across your fingers. You might start with previously on and think to yourself, what are those big steps? Let me know if you are summarizing in too much detail, and I'm going to talk about what that means when we conference. Okay, before you're off, take a look at our anchor chart. To truly understand what you're reading, it helps to take a moment to review what has already happened and what you're going to be thinking about before reading on, and to construct that previously on rendition of what you've already read. That way, as you do read on, you can be thinking, oh yes, this part connects back to what's already happened like this. If you've been away from your book for a while and you can't recall what's happening in your story, construct a previously in will help your brain get turned on and ready to read further into that book. How do readers summarize again? You're going to hold on to the story by pausing to summarize. So after you've read a little bit, pause in your mind and summarize what you've read so far. Think of the setting, the problem, and the wants. By doing that, you will make your reading a 10 out of 10.